Imagine how thirsty you get on a really hot, humid summer day. Maybe you've been doing some yard work or you've gone for a jog.
Well, you're certainly doing your job today, Mr. Sun. Oh, rats.
And you come back into the house and you see a delicious looking, cool glass of water. Then you take a sip. And it turns out it's salt water. Not all water is refreshing. Not every glass of water will quench your thirst. Sailors know this. They know that when you get thirsty at sea, you can't just dip into the ocean, take a scoop, and quench your thirst.
Pardon me, Mr. Let's Ration Everything, but what do you think we're floating on? Don't you know the poem? Water, water everywhere, so let's all have a drink.
Homer, no!
Why am I talking about what kind of water will quench your thirst? Well, because this glass of salt water is a lot like the Liberal budget. Let me explain. This may very well be the most expensive stack of paper in Canadian history. That's because this is the 2022-2023 main estimates. The main estimates is the fancy parliamentary term for government spending. In order for the Government of Canada to spend money, the House of Commons must first vote for it. And every year, every department has to submit to the House of Commons all the line item spending that they need to fulfill their program obligations. This year's budget is coming in at record levels of spending. And here's the relationship between this stack of government spending and that glass of salt water. All this spending is going to make inflation worse. Here's why. We all know that inflation started shooting up in 2021 after Justin Trudeau turned to the Bank of Canada and forced them to bankroll his deficits. And the Bank of Canada flooded the Canadian economy with over $400 billion of brand new money created right out of thin air, right at the same time that government lockdowns and restrictions were actually causing an economic decline. So more dollars chasing fewer goods caused inflation in the first place. And remember, along the same time, they were stopping along the way to reward their friends, trying to give the We organization $1 billion, funding the Canadian Infrastructure Bank with $35 billion, even though it hasn't completed a single project, giving sole-sourced contracts to Liberal MPs, all kinds of waste and mismanagement. And remember, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has said that 40% of all that new spending had nothing to do with the COVID pandemic. Don't let Liberals tell you anything otherwise.
Regardless of what that figure is exactly, future governments are going to have to carry that debt. How are you going to pay for that?
Interest rates are at historic lows, Glenn.
Look, this is not the news that any Canadian wanted to receive this morning.
That's hundreds of billions of dollars flooding out the door that had nothing to do with the pandemic that we will never get back. That's what caused inflation. And the reason why it's important to understand what causes inflation is because that's the only way that we will be able to stop it. And here's where the glass of salt water comes in. Because their solution is even more spending. And the new spending has to come from somewhere. You see, the government's running a massive deficit, so they don't actually have funds to increase spending. They have to borrow it. And right at the same time, the Bank of Canada is raising interest rates to offset inflation. The Liberals are doing is doubling down on their inflationary spending. Don't just take my word for it. It's not just economists and conservatives who are saying this. It's now even Liberals. Former Liberal Finance Minister John Manley said
that at the moment, at least, it appears that fiscal and monetary policy are not aligned. And the importance of that alignment is key. We're still running very large fiscal deficits. The government still talks about how much they're going to continue to spend. And this is a bit like driving your car with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. If they continue with the mindset that it's time to keep holding up the fire hose and spraying the money out just to keep everything going, then I think they're going to fuel inflation rather than to resist it. I think over the longer term, that's going to be a bad thing.
So let's just recap the facts. Massive government deficits force the bank to create new money to bankroll the spending. All that new money causes inflation, which forces the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates. Those interest rate hikes mean that you pay more for your mortgage and lines of credit. So you are literally paying for all of Justin Trudeau's spending through those higher interest charges. So if massive government deficits caused inflation and the interest rates that followed, then clearly the solution would be that smaller deficits and a return to balanced budgets would ease the inflationary pressure and allow the Bank of Canada to lower interest rates. But that's not what they're doing. They're spending billions more. In fact, just this year alone, the Liberals have added $60 billion in new spending just from 6 months ago. Even the current Liberal Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, just 6 months ago, projected a plan to get back to balanced budget. Even she realized that new spending would be, according to her, like pouring inflationary fuel on the fire.
Let's start with what we shouldn't do. I think that it is very important not to make the problem worse. I am very mindful of the importance of not pouring fiscal fuel on the flames of inflation.
That was just 6 months ago. In 6 months, the Liberals have increased government spending by $60 billion. And again, they don't have it. The government has to go out into the marketplace and borrow that money. When there's extra borrowing going on, borrowing costs go up. The only tool that the government has direct control over in terms of fighting inflation is the fiscal policy, is the budget. And what happened? They tabled their budget in March.
I'd like to table the 2023 budget documents.
1 month later, inflation went up again.
Some business news to bring you now. The inflation rate went up slightly in April for the first time in 11 months.
And 1 month after that, the Bank of Canada had to raise interest rates.
The Bank of Canada is raising its interest rate to 4.75% as it looks to tackle inflation head on.
This should be just so painfully obvious to everyone, and for most Canadians it is, but not to the Trudeau Liberals. This isn't just big picture, 30,000 foot level, philosophical debates between two political parties. This is painfully real for so many Canadian families. Over 1 million visitors to the food bank. Rent doubling. Mortgage payments doubling. The Liberals are running around saying that it's all this government spending that is going to help Canadians and that the alternative would be austerity. Canadian families are going through austerity. Canadian families, because of inflation, because of higher interest rates, are having to make difficult decisions, like whether or not to put their kids in various activities, whether or not they can continue to afford to drive to work. Some parents are visiting food banks for the first time in their lives just to be able to feed their family.
According to Ipsos polling conducted exclusively for Global News, 22% of Canadians say they are completely out of money, a 3-point increase from October. More than half, 52%, are concerned they might not have enough money to feed their family. And 8 in 10 Canadians remain concerned that inflation will make everyday items less affordable.
So the Liberal fiscal policy is a lot like that glass of salt water. At first glance, it might look like it's going to help. But just like when you take a sip of seawater, you realize that it makes your thirst even worse. The same is true for the Liberal budget. All that borrowing and spending is going to drive up inflation and interest rates along with it.
Bank of Canada raised its base lending rate to 5% today. That's the highest in over 2 decades. How concerned are you that Canadians are going to start defaulting on mortgages and other debts?
So what's the solution? Well, ignore the fear-mongering and hyper-partisanship from the Liberals, from Justin Trudeau, who's desperately trying to distract you from the fact that he caused the inflation crisis in the first place, and to go back, all the way back, to just 6 months ago, to maintain government spending at that level, or at least offset any new government program spending with corresponding savings. And if you don't think that the government wastes money, I'd invite you to just glance through some of these pages. Because many people believe Justin Trudeau when he promised that interest rates were going to stay low for a very long time.
Interest rates are at historic lows, Glenn.
And since inflation was also driving up home prices, many Canadians had to go out and get massive mortgages, believing Justin Trudeau when he said that those rates would stay low. Now that those rates are rising, we are headed towards a crisis point. In just a few years, a massive amount of Canadian mortgages will come up for renewal. And many people who may have qualified at 1.5 to 2.5% are suddenly going to be hit with massive increases in their mortgage costs. That puts not just Canadian households at risk, but our entire economy. In the weeks and months ahead, just understand that this is the choice before Canadians. Justin Trudeau's plan of doing more of the same of what caused the problem in the first place, or Pierre Poilievre's common sense conservative plan that will responsibly get our nation's finances back under control so that inflation comes down, interest rates come down, and you can stay in your house. And once again, thanks for watching. I forgot.